Shardless Bug to contain a Stoneforge Mystic package than it is to stop and treat the Angels. They don't have a lot in the way of counter spells because of Shardless Agent. They can't play with Dazes and Spell Pierces and so forth.
Braverman will be on the play, and he will start things off with a Thoughtseize. So we will take a look at Braun-Duin's hand. I imagine he may have some interest in Force of Willing this, perhaps, to protect a card like Sensei's Divine Top. And yes, he will Force of Will that Thoughtseize, removing Counterbalance.
And the Force of Will removing Counterbalance here I like a lot from Brian, because Counterbalance is not something he wants to lean on that heavily against a deck that features Abrupt Decay. So if he's protecting something as good as Sensei's Divining Top, maybe you'd want to Force of Will here, maybe not. But because Counterbalance is the blue card he's discarding, it makes a lot of sense.
Braverman does have a Force of Will in his hand, but he will not fight back, and Brian does have a Sensei's Divining Top. But Braverman will Force of Will this, removing a Baleful Strix. So away that goes.
And Michael's got to be happy with the game, the way this game is opening up, even though it's just the first turn here. Both players being resource light favors him quite a bit.
Deathrite Shaman and a Creeping Tar Pit. This Braverman's second turn. Over to Brian. We do go.
Cards like Shardless Agent and Ancestral Visions allow him to overwhelm Brian, assuming that he is able to attrition out the cards in Brian's hand.
One thing that we've kind of noticed as we've done coverage this year is players have allowed Sensei's Divine Top to resolve quite a bit, but I think now players are realizing if you can Force of Will that thing against Miracles, you got to counter it.
It makes the whole deck so much more efficient. It does sting to Force of Will because or take it with discard spells, because on the surface it's a mulligan. It's a card you put into play and it doesn't replace itself. But with all the shuffle effects and the miracles, it generates so much value that it is often correct to use whatever you have in hand to prevent it from getting onto the table.
And it's not pretty when they do have a follow up top. It makes your Force will look kind of bad. But again, you're trying to contain what is arguably the best card in the deck, or what one would say the most important card in the deck.
Sometimes you catch the bad end of it,
yep.
You know, if they have the second top, but it's worth fighting the fight.
Braun-Duin going to sacrifice a Scalding Tarn. Get a Tundra, spin the top here in just a moment. Tarmogoyf out there on the battlefield. We'll figure out how large that is in just a moment here. It looks to be a 4/5 as we have a sorcery, an instant, a land, and an artifact in the graveyard.
Good eye.
The die. Yeah.
Still got it.
I do, after all these years. All one of them. So Brian will take a look. He's already, underneath the pressure, you know. Right now is where he needs to find a card like Terminus.
And that's the value of Divining Top here. It makes it's so much more likely that he's able to set up whatever he's going for.
And it looks like he does have a copy of Terminus in his hand, and I believe a Brainstorm as well, so he can set things up pretty nicely. He also has a Preordain over there, too.
And how I said before, both players being resource light favors Michael. That is not the case if Brian has a Divining Top. His draw steps are just going to be so much better.
Brian going to draw 3 cards here with Brainstorm. We'll have to put 2 of them back in just a moment. But a Terminus is looking pretty appealing here to clear up those 2 creatures. And Braverman will be pretty light on resources, as you did mention. And Brian will be able to probably pull ahead with that top in some fashion.
The only question now is if Brian wants to use the Divining Top to Terminus on Michael's turn, or if he's willing to take this hit and take a draw step.
So Brainstorm does resolve. Brian will play a land. It's another copy of Tundra. Brian giving this turn a lot of thought about how he wants to use that Terminus that's on top of his deck now.
I think that I like using it in Michael's upkeep, as it prevents Michael from drawing a potential counterspell. Also, it denies Michael mana from the Deathrite Shaman. And Michael could use that mana to cast something like Liliana of the Veil, something that the Terminus does not clear.
Well, there it is.
Yeah, it looks like Brian agrees with my line of play.
So that'll put the creatures to the bottom. You know, I think maybe Brian gave a little bit of pause there, thinking maybe I could, you know, maybe snap up that Creeping Tar Pit if he gets a little extra greedy.
That is asking a lot.
Yes, that's Brian being extra greedy if that's his line of thought, I think. So
you're asking for Michael to rip a land and then use the mana that he has to animate a Tar Pit. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm saying that's asking a lot.
Verdant Catacombs will be sacrificed there. Braverman will shuffle his deck and present over to BBD. See what he has now that he has 3 mana. Feels like Charlotte's Agent territory, and it is. The reveal is a Tarmogoyf.
It's about the best reveal here.
Yeah. Get a clock right back on the table. Still a 4/5. Braun-Duin does draw a card. Of course, it is a Sensei's Divining Top. Again, we do know about the Preordain that's in his hand. Counterbalance as well. He was just trying to make it out of that turn without Braverman being able to rebuild a board so he can get the top plus counterbalance lock into play, but not able to do that right away.
And counterbalance is dubious in this spot regardless. You're playing against a deck with Abrupt Decay, and Michael doesn't need to resolve any more spells to win this game. If he rips another land, he has 9 points of damage coming across with Brian at 17. That's a 2-turn clock. That's why I like this. The first order of business is cantripping because trying to get counterbalance to stick here doesn't make a lot of sense. Trying to set up another Terminus, finding some spot removal. That's what Brian's really in the market for right now.
There's top after the Preordain. Pass the turn back. Braverman. 3 mana here. It's a Liliana. So pre-combat, he will play the Planeswalker. And the off chance maybe it gets countered, it beefs up the Tarmogoyf a little bit. So Brian will spin this here.
And it's just another dimension of attack, too. Adding another creature to the board right now, maybe it's good, but it's dangerous because Brian's looking for Terminus regardless. But being able to do something productive that doesn't involve putting another creature into play is a really good turn for Michael. And now Brian's put in a pretty tough spot. He has Force of Will amongst the cards in his top 3 he's looking at with the Divining Top right now. Does he want to draw Force of Will and then pitch that and his counterbalance this Liliana the Veil? That's quite a bit of resources. It sets him back some amount of mana because he has to redeploy the Divining Top. But it's also not clear he can let this Liliana resolve.
Okay. Decisions here for BBD. Gonna activate the top. Draw a card. And there's a force. Moving counterbalance again.
And I think, again, a part of the reason this is happening, because the card in question is counterbalance, Michael has an advanced board and Abrupt Decay in his deck. Brian doesn't want to lean too heavily on that card.
There's an attack for 7. Braverman's going to play a land, pass the turn back. That land's important because that means he can fire up Tar Pit.
He is looking at a lethal attack next turn. Now, if he's going to make a move there and go for it is another question altogether, because Brian could conceivably set up a Terminus and then Michael loses everything.
That's always the fear when you play against this deck. It's super risky to go for it.
But the other side is it's also super risky to give Brian an additional draw step.
Yep.
So, you know, it's very challenging to play against this deck.
Brian spinning that top very quickly. Going to sacrifice a Flooded Strand, going down to 8 in the process. If you've ever watched Braun-Duin play with Miracles before, he's very aggressive in how he uses everything. He said he always says, I'm more comfortable having no cards in my hand when I play this deck, because if I have a top in play, I basically have 3 cards in hand the entire time.
I'm not a huge fan of this shuffle right here if Brian's really only looking for Terminus, maybe Swords of Plowshares, because you're basically giving away that it wasn't in the first top 3 cards that you were looking at. You could have he could have done this on Michael's turn inside of combat anyway, where he looks at 3, it's not there, shuffles his deck and looks again. But you may be giving Michael the incentive he needs to activate his Tar Pit and finish off the game.
Braverman will draw a card here. See if he's willing to move in and essentially go for it.
I mean, Brian looked at, it's a blind look. He shuffled his card and shuffled his deck and rearranged 3 cards. So there's no setup here. There's no engineering. That doesn't mean it's not there.
There's certainly some appeal, I think, in this situation as well to putting your opponent down to 1, because that cuts off Brian's fetch lands.
Yes.
For example. So you give him an extra turn, but then you give him no reshuffles and cuts off Force of Will. But Braverman looks like he's going to move in here.
I do like the argument of just saying him down to 1 for the reasons that you mentioned. You don't even have to worry about a hypothetical entreat coming off the top because you have a tar pit left over. So blockers don't really matter.
You can tell Braverman's a little gun shy. He sacrificed the fetch land, yep, and he's not going to move in with the tar pit. This will give Braun-Duin another turn, and Braverman's going to just pass the turn back.
And for the reasons you mentioned, I think if that attack would have knocked Brian down to 2 instead of 1, there's a really good chance that Michael would have gone for it and activated the tar pit. But because Brian being on 1 is such a significant number, Michael willing to take a slightly more conservative approach.
So Brian will just play a Plains after spinning the top and pass the turn back. And now for Braverman, no reason to fire up that tar pit. You can just basically say, hey, you got to have it.
Yeah, I mean, Michael could beat 1 piece of spot removal here.
Now, things do get a little more hairy, if Brian has Swords of Plowshares and Snapcaster Mage, both of those things. But, he's make him have that, I think. Yeah, and Brian's going to pack it up and pack it in. So Michael Braverman's going to win game number 1 here over Brian Braun-Duin. Charlotte's Bug up a game over Blue-White Miracles.
That's a spot where, yes, it's hypothetically possible that's Brian's hand, but he's shown so much weakness over the course of the last couple of turns that there's probably not much going on there. And Michael made the obvious straightforward attack, and it was good enough for the win.
Sideboard time. You've got BBDs in front of you.
A Wear Tear, 2 Pyroblast, a Council's Judgment, a Humility, 2 copies of Recipes, a Pithy Needle, a Batter Skull, two more copies of Stoneforge Mystic, 3 Meddling Mage, and a Keranos God of Storms. So I think he's going to want to bring in the second Batter Skull. Brian does this in a lot of matchups that are going to go on for a very long time. Often your opponent has an answer to the first Batter Skull. You play Stoneforge Mystic, they Thoughtseize it. And now that dimension of the game is over. So in long games, Brian traditionally brings in the second copy of Batter Skull. I think the Keranos could be kind of well suited for this matchup. It's going to be slow. It's outside of Charlotte's Bug's removal suite. It's a pretty stable way to win the game. I think the cards like the 2 Pyroblasts and the Council's Judgment, 2 copies of Rest in Peace. Some of the cards along those lines are going to come in here as well. Maybe not the Rest in Peace, although it is good against Deathrite Shaman and Tarmogoyf. I think that if nothing else, Brian wants to get away from counterbalance in this matchup because Abrupt Decay makes it so troubled to try to get that online. And so Brian just wants some generic catch-all answer cards in place of counterbalance in this matchup.
On the other side of things, I'm looking at 2 Fluster Storms, 2 copies of Disfigure, 2 Hymn to Torak, a Vendilion Click, 2 Nile Spellbomb, got a Maelstrom Pulse, a Toxic Deluge, a Notion Thief, a Golgari Charm, a Baleful Strix, and a copy of Liliana of the Veil. I think it's pretty easy to start with an additional Planeswalker here in Liliana. You can make an argument for Golgari Charm, being okay against counterbalance and some other things. I'm not sure if Brian leaves counterbalance in, though.
Most likely it gets cut. There is a guessing game of, maybe he removes his Abrupt Decays because he knows I'm going to remove my counterbalances, so my counterbalances are actually good. If Michael's familiar with Brian's list, he knows that he has Stoneforge Mystic on top of counterbalance, so there's no way Abrupt Decay is leaving his deck if he's informed of that. So I think you don't really need the Golgari Charm because Brian has all the incentive he needs to take his counterbalances out of his deck already.
Maelstrom Pulse doesn't seem bad in this matchup. Kind of just plays a role of cleanup duty on a couple of different things. Jason, a couple of other options there. And I think Vendilion Click will be pretty useful here as well here for Braverman. Just a kind of way to break serve, force some action from Brian.
I think the 2 copies of Hymn to Torak could potentially be excellent in this matchup too. It's going to go on for a long time, these games most likely. There's some matchups where you don't want to have a bunch of hymns because drawing the second copy of Hymn to Torak is really bad. You don't have that kind of time. And sometimes drawing the first copy isn't even that good. Thinking against, let's say, Rug Delver. Sometimes him can be pretty good against them, but sometimes it's way too slow to the party. This is not that kind of matchup. Him's going to be excellent against Brian at most stages of the game, especially because he has to try to win the game through his hand. He's not doing it through counterbalance, Sensei's Divine Top plus Entreat the Angels. He has to put Stoneforge Mystic into play and go get a Batter Skull, or resolve a Keranos, or something along those lines, chase the Mind Sculptor. So because of that, Hymn's going to be particularly good against Brian's build.
Game number 2 underway here in just a moment. While these players do finish shuffling up, it's almost September, so that means it is the first time for Star City Games game night.
Yep, the cutoff for this was, for the September month was August 11th. If you want to get on board for October, got to get that going soon. Available at all participating stores, 2 pins and 8 foil tokens per week. New pins and foils designed each month. What you can see on the screen there is the September suite. Every Wednesday night, StarCityGames.com/game night for more information. This is a more casual focused program, just pins and foils being given away here. So stores, use your own discretion, run whatever formats you want to, sanction them, don't sanction them, it's fine. Just get some more people in your store playing every Wednesday night.
And of course, it is worldwide.
Yep, outside the United States, that's fine. We can send these kits wherever. So again, sign up now, StarCityGames.com/game night for more information.
Starts this Wednesday, as September is already here. It'll be Labor Day when you and I are flying home. Unless you're staying a couple days here in Jersey?
No, not this time. I am coming out early. So there's this one, and then there's the Open in September, and then there's another Open in November, and I think I'm coming out early for the Open in November is how I'm doing this.
Cool, and then there'll be an Open in Cleveland never, so you'll never get to go there and see how awesome it is. Yeah. Awesome. Maybe we'll go watch a basketball game together at some point.
Yeah, we should. We should do that.
See what happens. Sensei's Divining Top going to fire off here for BBD to start things up.
Basic Island Divining Top is about the best start this deck can ask for.
Can't be wastelanded, and you've got your best card.
Yeah.
Braverman with just a polluted Delta. Brian's going to spin on the upkeep. A little interesting here. Maybe he doesn't have another land. We will see.
It appears as though Pithy Needle has come in, I would guess, primarily for Liliana the Veil, possibly for Deathrite Shaman as well.
Some good targets in this matchup.
Yeah.
Jace as well, depending on where things are at. And there is the Needle. I would crack that.
Egg.
So Delta will go to the graveyard. Down to 19 goes Braverman. We'll see what land he wants to search up.
I would imagine, because Michael did not have a Deathrite Shaman on turn 1, this is naming Liliana the Veil, but we will find out momentarily.
Going to go with a copy of Bayou.
This feels like a challenging matchup in general for Blue-White Miracles, and especially because of the way that Brian has constructed his deck. Because it feels to me often that the best tool in this matchup is Entreat on the Miracle side, and he does not have any of that.
It's a him to Torak, and Brian immediately going to start shuffling his hand. He knows he's going to lose 2 cards, as the Needle did name Liliana. So Braverman is going to go after the grip here.
Michael's list with 2 hymns in the main deck and then 2 more in the sideboard, and I have to assume he's at the full 4 post board.
So away go 2 cards. 2 lands is what Braverman has found. Into Flooded Strand and an island. And Braun-Duin will spin the top. Looking for a little help on the upkeep here before he draws a card, so he will draw that card. Play a Volcanic Island and just simply pass the turn back over to Braverman, who will draw a card here. Does have a Creeping Tar Pit in his hand.
Oh no!
Another him.
My goodness.
It's a way to steal a game. Hey, I said Brian doesn't like to play this deck, a lot of cards in his hand. So,
I don't think this is exactly what...
Hey, his words, not mine. All right?
When he says he wants to play close to empty-handed, I think he means because he's casting stuff, not because he's getting hemmed on turns 2 and 3.
I get confused kind of easily.
It's easy to misinterpret the statement. I know what you mean, but...
Brian going to spin the top in response to this hymn. There's a chance here that maybe he wants to draw a card with the Sensei's Divining Top to try to protect one of the cards that he does have. We'll see if that's what his line of play is here.
This is brutal regardless.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we don't see this a lot in Legacy anymore, you know, just the devastating hymn to Torak. But it can't happen.
Not a lot of people have access to 4 copies even when they are playing some.
So a Swords and a Batter Skull are gone. Braverman's going to play a Creeping Tar Pit. His opponent has no cards in grip. Braun-Duin going to draw and just simply pass the turn back over to Braverman. Braverman building up a very nice advantage here. Draw for the turn is a copy of Ancestral Visions. This is a Tarmogoyf. And now it's time to suspend the Visions. You imagine this game's going to last 4 more turns, so 3 cards eventually coming here for Braverman.
Well, if it doesn't last 4 more turns, it's because Brian's dead already.
Yeah.
So I think Michael's happy with this Ancestral regardless.
A Vendilion Click on the end step from BBD's. Tarmogoyf is a 4/5. See if this resolves.
One of the cards that Brian lost to these hymns, it was one of his batter skulls, and you can kind of see the merits of bringing in the second copy. These games are going to go on for a really long time. This could have easily been, you know, a Thoughtseize that got rid of it or what have you, and having access to a second copy is a valuable added dimension.
Yeah, he's been a big fan of that for some time now, the second batter skull.
It just comes up so often that something happens to the first one, and without a way to reshuffle, it's just gone forever. That dimension of your deck is gone, and it's so powerful.
Force of Will counter the Vendilion Click. Braverman wants to keep this board clear. So away goes the 3-1 Fairy. Tarmogoyf's moving on up in life. It's a 5-6 now. And Brian's going to spin that top on up, keep going to look at a Council's Judgment, among other things. Oh, there's a Rest in Peace. That's timely.
It's a good starting point here.
Yeah. The graveyards do go away, and that means Tarmogoyf will not get to play.
And Brian's making a game of it. He's very resource light, of course, and he needs to find an answer for the tar pit long term. But given how powerful Michael's start here was, Brian is keeping his head above water.
I mean, this, of course, shows the power of Sensei's Divining Top in this deck. It's what it's all about. Braverman's turn is just tar pit in, kick it back. That's a slow clock, and it uses all of Braverman's mana for the turn. Now, of course, he does have that Visions ticking down, as Braun-Duin will play a Scalding Tarn. Now he's in the tank a little bit here. Maybe he wants to fetch away and spin the top again. He says, I'll spin now, get some more information, see what that third card down is. And Council's Judgment among the cards that he is looking at right now.
Also a Karanos, and I think he wanted to know if land number 5 was coming, because that's going to dictate a lot about how much he values Karanos at.
Karanos is one of the kind of cards that can turn this game around, possibly steal it for Brian. Braverman, tar pitting again. We'll draw a card. Source of Plowshares, perhaps? Yes, sir. This is why people are becoming a huge proponent of Force Will in the top. That's the only card keeping him in the game.
For sure.
That's it. There's top again.
And if Brian gets to Karanos here, he may be able to overpower Michael, even if this Ancestral comes off and finds some reasonable action.
And I think that's part of the reason we haven't seen Brian fetch yet, is because he wants to get that thing into play. That's the kind of card that can let him, you know, get back in this game, changes the way that Braverman has to play the game. If the God of Storms can get into play, we're looking at a wildly different game.
So I got to preview this card for Star City Games some months ago. I did not predict it would show up in Legacy.
Yep. Hey, me either.
Yeah.
It's just such a unique threat in what it does.
I did predict sort of generic finisher for a control deck. That's pretty easy to guess. But I did not think much of its potential in Legacy.
Ah, chase the Mind Sculptor for Braverman. Finally, some action. So that's going to come in. And it's going to press the Brainstorm button. So a Brainstorm, a Tropical Island, and another copy of Inatorak. Braverman has his last two in his hand.
Probably not a lot to be done with extra hymns at this point. Brian's going to be playing more or less empty-handed for the remainder of the game.
Brian going to spin the top here on Braverman's end step. See if he can find anything useful to do.
Hard to find something too useful to do in this spot. Michael's board is contained with the exception of the card Jace the Mind Sculptor that Brian's not really equipped to handle once he gets into play.
Yeah, the problem here for Brian, you know, he's got like a Council's Judgment floating near the top. It's going to spin. But the thing I think for BBD here is, you know, the thought process is like, I don't want to, you know, fetch away my Karanos, and he's also got a Jace floating in there.
It's a tough shuffle. He would really like to get to Karanos here because not much is really going on in this game. Michael probably can't counter it. He probably can't get it off the table once it's in play. And Brian is so strapped on resources, so many of his draws are not that powerful right here, that I think he really wants to get to this Karanos. But every time he looks at 3 and there's no 5th land coming, it's just, all right, what do I do this turn? I can't really shuffle. And none of the other cards are offering me that much assistance. I can't even cast the Council's Judgment that I'm floating on this top 3 right now.
If he does that, he'd have to let his top go, and the top is really the only thing that's keeping him in the game.
There's no way he's letting this top go. That's the absolute last, that's the worst case scenario.
That feels like the white flag.
Yeah.
And that's the decision that BBD's got to make right now, is does he let that go? Does he fetch away these cards that he's looking at? Again, Jason Karanos are mighty powerful, and those might be the only cards that can get him back into the game. But this is the decision that he has to make in this spot. Because before, everything was okay. The visions, you hope maybe Braverman bricks on that. But when Jace is out there, well, now you have to do something.
And there's a fair number of bricks in Michael's deck at this point. The Needle set on Liliana the Veil, that's not offering much help. Tarmogoyf and Deathrite Shaman, those don't work because of the Rest in Peace. It's possible Baleful Strix isn't even in the deck anymore. So you're looking at a very few cards that really matter for Michael to draw right now.
He's unhappy sacking that fetch land. You can see it, a deep breath. He does not want to do that. But he needs to get a Tundra so he can Council's Judgment away this Jace, I believe. And he's got to hope for the best after he shuffles his deck, presents it over to Braverman, that the top 3 cards, when he spins that top again, are useful. That's all he can really do.
Tough to get away from the Karanos, but with no 5th mana coming, how long are you going to hold that up while Michael is, chasing every turn and having an Ancestral come off?
So the will of the Council may take care of Jace. Depends on what is in Braverman's hand, as it is possible he does have a 1-mana counterspell, does have Flusterstorm in the sideboard. Flusterstorm would be a bit of a beating here.
I'm not a huge fan of it in this matchup because the cards that you care about are Planeswalkers, Artifacts, or, if Brian does have Counterspell, it's Terminus that's hard to Flusterstorm, or Supreme Verdict, which you can't. So.
But oddly enough, Braverman actually drew a copy of Flusterstorm for his draw. So that card is in his deck after sideboard. Here's a Brainstorm. Of course, that will be exiled due to Rest in Peace. So 3 cards coming here for Braverman. A Brainstorm is 1, a Verdant Catacombs is 2, and a Charlotte's Agent is 3. So Braverman's got to decide what to put back, and of course he can make it a perfect Brainstorm because he does have the fetch line. You see the 2 copies of Hymn to Torith. There's also Liliana hiding over there that's being taken care of by Pithing Needle. So definitely some useless cards that he can put back.
At this point, I think the card he really wants to find is Abrupt Decay somehow, either off of these cantrips or off of the Shardless Agent. I don't know if he cares more about blowing up the Needle because he has Liliana in hand or getting recipes off the table, but I'm sure he's happy getting either out of there. The combination of the 2 is really preventing Michael from doing anything pressure-wise in this game, and even though he has a considerable resource advantage, he needs to press it while he can.
Underground Sea comes into play off the Verdant Catacombs. Braverman does have another Brainstorm. He's going to deploy Charlotte's Agent, hope to cascade into something spicy. That'll work.
That was what he was looking for.
Yep.
And now the question is, which one do you want to get off the table? Because both of them are pretty good in here.
Needle, he can take down with the Decay to turn on Liliana, or Rest in Peace, he can take down to turn on his Deathrite Shaman, and the Tarmogoyf that's in play.
I would err on the side of getting the Rest in Peace off the table because I don't think Liliana is going to be that great in this game because Brian's going to be working empty-handed and using the top to engineer his draws.
I don't think that he needs Liliana to win this game. Tarmogoyf is going to put a clock on, and now it forces Brian to top in all sorts of different directions.
Yeah.
There's an attack for 1.
I just think Michael has more cards in hand than Brian, and Brian's going to be because of the top, he's going to be pretty effective at just drawing for the turn, either playing a land or casting whatever. This means that plussing Liliana is much worse for Michael than it is for Brian, so I would have gotten the Rest in Peace off the table.
Stoneforge Mystic, the draw for Brian after spinning the top. Braverman looks like he may want to fight over this, try to find a Force of Will. He's got some interest in casting Brainstorm here, it looks like. And that's what he will do. So hit 1 is him, 2 is Shardless, 3 is a Vendilion Click.
That is a pretty juicy Brainstorm.
Yeah. It's pretty easy to put back Liliana and him here, as those are going to be relatively useless. Him, of course, could stay around and take the Batterskull that Brian searches up.
That's the other line of play that he has here. He could hypothetically, you know, because he has a Charlotte's Agent here, he could set the him as the card that he Charlotte's Agents into,
yep.
Get that Batterskull out of there.
So the Brainstorm does resolve. And now the Mystic will resolve. And Brian will quickly go grab a Batterskull here, which will give him a shuffle for his deck, and he does have that 1 mana left over to spin the top when he decides that's necessary.
And you're seeing the upshot of the second Batterskull on the list. It has come up in this game. That's gone on for many turns. It's unlikely that this Batterskull enters play because of the him in Michael's hand, but at least Brian gave himself the best shot to get a Batterskull into play, which is one of his most powerful dimensions against a deck like Bug. This removal is primarily Abrupt Decay.
We have seen players in the past play a card like Academy Ruins.
Yeah.
Instead of the second Batterskull. Also helps to get back a card like Engineer Explosives or Pay the Needle, or heck, even a top. But Brian opting to go with the 2 copies of Batterskull. There's the Agent. There's a him. Goodbye Batterskull. Tarmogoyf getting a little bit bigger now.
Yeah, Sorcery plus Artifact entering in the graveyard that turn. And now this dimension is stranded from Brian. He has no way to reshuffle his graveyard. He has no third Batterskull. So Michael is now in the clear.
An attack here for 5. Puts Brian on a 2-turn clock after the damage is dealt. This is looking pretty tough here for Miracles. Gonna spin that top.
Michael with still resources left over.
Yeah. Aha. And Brian has found a Terminus finally.
Now, Michael has at least 1 Flusterstorm. 1 Flusterstorm does not get it done here, but if he has more cantrips, a second Flusterstorm, he may be able to fight this Terminus.
There's a Volcanic Island into play. Time to spin the top here for BBD. Council's Judgment, along with Terminus, and a mystery card is what he's looking at.
I believe Jace the Mind Sculptor.
Not bad.
Going to be hard to get that into play because Michael's board is pretty advanced at this point.
Things get very interesting now as Braverman draws a card, because for Brian, he might be forced to take this blow. So take 7 points of damage and then Terminus and then cast Jace.
Yeah. And all this collapses if Michael has a single piece of resistance.
Yes. There's a quick block. And that might be Brian's plan here. He'll take 4, go down to 6. Tarmogoyf will grow a little bit, and Braverman is going to, I believe, just pass the turn back. He's got that Vendilion Click at the ready. And we can't forget about that interaction between Vendilion Click and Miracles.
Yep.
You can take the card after they draw it. So they'll draw it and they'll reveal it to the Miracle trigger, and then you click it to the bottom of their deck, and then they can't Miracle it.
When the Miracle trigger is on the stack, the card in question is in their hands. So Vendilion Click is live.
It's a wonky one, but it's one of the cool things about Legacy. Brian is going to spin his top, and with that on the stack, he will activate his top. So now the activation of top drawing a card will happen. Terminus will be cast, and let's not forget the look is still on the stack. Braverman rearranging his mana.
Legacy is full of funky interactions. Most of them are caused by very old cards that are templated in odd ways. Miracles is an exception to that rule.
This is a Brainstorm. A couple of lands and a Liliana are found. So Braverman will have to put back a couple of cards here. But what he's doing right now is he is upping the spell count so that Flusterstorm can get the job done on this Terminus.
Yeah. The Flusterstorm will now be a mana leak, effectively, because this Terminus will have been cast. There's a Brainstorm that's been cast, and then the Flusterstorm counts itself.
And again, it may feel a little bit strange. Why is Flusterstorm in Braverman's deck after sideboard when he has Charlotte's Agent in his deck for situations just like this?
Yeah, requires a little bit of engineering. And this is really the only card that I can fight other than, you know, some cantrips and some soft counters, but
I imagine Brian was taken a little bit off guard by him having a Flusterstorm to take care of that. But it works out great for Braverman. And now Brian's spinning of the top, of course, that was the last thing that resolved in the stack, will happen. So now Brian's going to look at a top, at a Jace, and another card. And he was hoping this tournament would resolve, clear the board away, and then he can cast Jace on an empty board.
yeah.
That was the big grand plan, but Braverman's had a lot of cards in his hand the entire game, but that's what Charlotte's Bug is known for.
When Brian went for that Terminus, Michael was passing the turn with 5 cards left in his hand. So Brian made the play that he could, but I think if you asked him, what do you think is happening in this game right now? I think Brian, if he was being honest, would have told you, I'm probably losing.
Yeah, I think so too. He is just so far behind.
Yeah.
And
Those
it would
early
take-
hymns,
Yeah, they were devastating.
too much of his raw resources got stripped away. Divine Top has helped, but it sounds easy to say, or a simplified version, but basically it's been hard for him to play lands and cast spells because so many of his resources were stripped so early on in the game.
Council's Judgment will take care of Tarmogoyf, but Braverman's going to deploy a Vendilion Click. And Brian knows that he's beaten. He will concede the game. So Michael Braverman is going to defeat Brian Braun-Duin 2-0. Charlotte's Bug taking down Blue-White Miracles. And Michael Braverman is 10-1 in this tournament.
And another good performance for Charlotte's Bug. We've talked earlier about Jerry Thompson having a very good performance thus far with this deck, and Michael Braverman as well.
I can say with some amount of confidence, now of course there's nothing certain in Magic, but I can say with a heavy amount of confidence, it feels as though Charlotte's Bug may have been the best deck for this tournament.
Well, it's very good at beating decks that play to the